Good to have you all here, up here on stage. Thank you for joining. I would like to ask you, after your description of European sovereignty, what support do you expect from Germany?
A lot. We obviously have the same objective. First, really to make Europe the strongest economic power in the world, which we can do. For this, we need to agree on an energy strategy, decarbonized, reliable, at a competitive price, and that's the discussion in Brussels today. We need a very strong industrial policy, investment in the strategic sectors, and that's what you've been discussing today. I mean, technology, energy, we can be first. I think sometimes, as an example, we forget that the Inflation Reduction Act is likely a reaction to Europe putting in place a lot of support for green industry. And we work hand in hand to actually make the Commission help us do that faster and in a simpler way than what it has been doing sometimes.
Yeah, that's actually what we've been hearing today, that the idea is wonderful. In German, we have the saying, gut gemeint ist nicht gut gemacht. Like, you do it. The intention is a good one, but the way it plays out, you know, it doesn't play out the way it's supposed to. And, you know, this morning somebody quoted the bureaucracy monster in Brussels. So obviously there's lots to do. Now, let me ask the three others here, let me ask the men up here on stage. Do you agree that Europe can be the economic powerhouse #1 in the world?
This is like the German national team, you know. We can play Champions League or we can play the First League, but I think in certain areas we might be First League. I only can speak for the digitization and for the digital infrastructure, and I think it will take years to catch up to the ecosystem of the Americans and the ecosystem of Asia. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is simple, it's exactly what you described, what was not executed over the last 15 years. What you described, I hear since 10 years. We have no digital single market in Europe. We have 27 markets. In every market, antitrust rules are trying to protect 3 or 4 operators at minimum. This makes 120 players in Europe competing. We have 35 operators in Europe with less than 500,000 customers, and they are running the machines totally unproductive. While in the US, where Deutsche Telekom is with 100 million customers, with 3 operators in a competition. We have economies of scale, we have the power, you know, to generate cash flow, we can drive innovation, and we can drive infrastructure build out. And this is since the last decade not changed in Europe, and therefore, if we are not fundamentally changing the paradigm of how we are dealing with digitalization and how we become only consumers, only users in this digital ecosystem. So I think, you know, the gap is widening. Just, you know, to draw a picture on AI and other pictures, you know, I have heard Anef Alpha and other companies in Germany now, which are unbelievable, innovative, but the big players are sitting in the US, and we are traveling to the US, just coming back from the US, and we are operating with OpenAI, with Microsoft, with Bard on Google, but we are not operating with European players in this regard. We missed that boat. And to be constructive, yeah, we should, as first facts and brutal facts. That's the first start to change something. You know, the problem which we're having is we have a learned paradigm, how we were successful over the last 30, 50 years. And it's very difficult for us to unlearn. And we need not, you know, always the old answers for the new world. We need a picture, a strategy, how we want to create a world in the next 5 to 10 years. And then we define a new regulation, a kind of new definition about where we are investing. But I'm missing this discussion about how we want to shape the world of the future and what kind of regulation and political impact is needed.
So let me just ask you very quickly for a few sentences on the complacency. How do we get rid of the complacency in Europe then?
Look, first is I think we need all this curiosity for new technologies. The first thing is always starts with us.
Well, I think there's curiosity, but then people leave, right?
Sorry?
There is curiosity, but then people leave because it's easier to do business elsewhere and to do the research elsewhere. And
I'm facing in AI and new technologies which are coming, Web 3.0 and other things, I'm facing first the question of what is the risk for me, then rather what can I do with this? We are always, seeing something as a threat than rather something as kind of a playful a tool which we can use. The second what we need is, I think, that starts as well with competence. And I'm not, addressing that only to politicians. I think it starts as well in the companies, in the way how we are dealing with these new technologies. The second what it needs an understanding about where the money can come from to even greenhouse, to start businesses. I give you another number. In the 50s to 70s, Germany invested 4% of its GDP into innovation. By the way, why? Because every product which we are producing is losing price value and is getting commoditized. That's happening with telecommunication, that happens with industry production everywhere. So if you want to have a growth economy, you need always this element of innovation to grow a company and to grow a state or to grow Europe. Since the 70s, you have constantly reduced the spending in innovation. Today, we are at 1%. While China and US is innovating with 2.5% or even 3% today. So the gap is widening. We have to spend more money for these innovations and for long-term perspective, both from IPSAI, from the European Commission, from the governmental service, and as well from the companies. The third thing I think what we need is another regulation. In my industry, over the last decade, there was only one paradigm, which was get the prices down. This was the political intention. By the way, consumers love it. The price for telecommunication in Europe is 50%, half of what we are earning with our customers in the US. Now think about if you have a machine with 100 million customers plus double the price of Europe, where do you think is the profitability? It sits in the US. And if you have profitability, you have cash which you can reinvest in your economy. And this is the spinning wheel of an industry which is working. When you only reduce prices, as has happened in our industry, today almost every big telco is not earning its capital costs due to the super investments there and the low prices. So I'm a little bit pessimistic with regard that Europe, with this kind of regulation, is going to catch up.
He's giving you a lot of homework. So he was talking about money, perfect cue for you. Do you believe in Europe as the economic powerhouse in the world, and what needs to change on the capital markets within Europe for this to happen, actually?
Well, first of all, it's always difficult to follow Tim Höttges because everything what he said, you can almost one-to-one copy and paste to the banking industry. By the way,
glad you two get along.
By the way, also the pricing for banking products in the US versus Europe, it's exactly the same. Capital markets and advisory business in the US is double as attractive from a pricing point of view as in Europe. I think we are missing three items, and then I come to the Capital Markets Union, but also there, as Tim is rightly pointing out, let's speak the facts. 2009, the global share of the EU 27 countries in the capital markets was 22%. End of last year, it was 10%, it will go down to 8%. Now the problem is that some people are saying, oh, that's not bad because the nominal investment is the same. We lost half of the share in the capital markets. And why? Because you have investors in Asia, you tell them it's Temasek, GIC, you have the Norwegian investors, and they are simply not prepared to invest into 27 different regimes. It's exactly the same like for the telecommunication. And the problem is not only that the regulation is different. A capital markets is not different from the harbor in Hamburg. And let me explain that to you. The deeper the water is, the more liquid is it. And that is so important, why it's so important now also for a harbor in Hamburg, that it digs and digs because the big container ships must come in. And once you have a big harbor with a lot of liquidity, then you immediately get the other capital markets participants like venture capital, private equity, all that is coming. If we are not managing to getting a capital markets union in Europe, the Green Deal will not come. We have 500 billion of net investments in Europe, which needs to be financed over the next 30 years. Each year, 500 billion. Imagine that number and just take the 100 billion of defense budget, which we had in Germany, rightfully so spent last year and approved last year. That was 100 billion. That was almost a generational financing and investment, again, for the right reasons. We need 500 billion of financing in order to turn this economy to net zero over the next 30 years per year. If we don't get the capital markets union, i.e. one capital market for Europe, we will not get the money from Singapore, from Asia, from the US. Now, the chance is actually great because the people believe in European engineering. The people believe in our democracy. The people believe in our values. But we need to offer something efficient. Something efficient, it's one market. And if in those days where globalization is at least halted, I'm not saying it's coming to a stop. I'm a firm believer in globalization. But where we have a different globalization than ever before, if we don't work on a European Union from a product market, but also from a capital markets union, we will not make it. The preconditions would be there, but it needs mindset, it needs braveness, and it needs decisions. And if it doesn't come, we will not make the Green Deal. And I think that's actually something which is linked to growth, which we urgently need.
I would like to, just as I did with Tim Höttges, ask you a second question, and takes us a bit away from what you just said. But up until now, we regard the dollar to be the world's leading currency, and we know that China has ambitions to change this, probably. We've been talking a lot about China. So what would it do to the European sovereignty with regards to financial markets and the issues you've just explained if we move to a more multilateral world currency system or world leading currency, if the dollar loses its importance?
Well, I think, therefore, the most important is that we have one European market first. And this has nothing to do with the Capital Markets Union, but we need to make sure, like Tim was just saying for his telecom industry, that once we are doing banking business, that we have the same treasury and liquidity regulations across those 27 countries. Do you really believe this is for Deutsche Bank, where we're operating in 16 European countries, that I have the same liquidity rules around the European countries, that I can move liquidity from right to left? I can't. Now, if we can't make that liquid, and liquidity is all about markets, you need to have liquid markets, and that means that you need to move liquidity. If we can't do that, then we will not actually compete with the big currencies. Again, Europe has the capacity to make it. And that also means, in my view, like we need to do it sometimes as corporate CEOs or bank CEOs, you need to take decisions and you also need to make the one or the other compromise while you take a decision. But standing still, banking union, capital markets union is standing still since 10 years. If we are not moving on this, then the euro will lose. However, the investors actually want a strong euro. The investors want to have European banks being part of the strategic landscape. And therefore, it's so important that we start with one European market. If we work on that one, the capital markets union will come by itself. And as bridging instruments in order to get there, let's rework securitizations. Let's make sure that the bank's balance sheets is getting more liquid so that we can finance more of that what is coming, which is the future of Europe. If we don't do this, then we will lose out. And then obviously, if there is no investment coming into Europe, then also the euro will lose. Now
our hopes are pinned on you. How do you perceive Europe's potential?
Well, if I give my perspective as a humble entrepreneur on Europe's chances in e-mobility, if you look, which is basically combining an electrical powertrain, a battery, and a vehicle. on the battery side, obviously, the battery industry kind of evolved in Japan. It moved to Korea, but really scaled in China, and where we are, somewhere 5 to 10 years behind in that scale up. If we then look at the electrifications of vehicles, you can really say that the modern drive really started in the US West Coast, and again was very strongly adopted by China to drive scale with China's plan to go from zero combustion engines by 2040. So China kind of adopted both and poured a lot of money into this industry. They looked at what was working, what was not working, and the things that were working, they were pouring more money into and created a number of giants like CATL, BYD, etc. I still think Europe have a good shot. We are a couple of years behind, but we have, if you look at the basic research, I think we are on par when it comes to what we see in other regions. I think we have some of the best brands in the world when it comes to consumer brands in the car industry. I think we have fantastic tool and machine builders that can develop and that can drive productivity gains in the industry. And we have a thought-through sustainability agenda that if we combine and drive this together, as well as pushing, the initiatives and the entrepreneurs forward, I think we can catch up. I absolutely think so.
She mentioned the access to critical raw materials. How much leeway do you have right now to set up a safety net along your supply chain?
So if I look at where we are, we have secured the raw materials we need for our first phase of our expansion. And we've done it with allied countries like Australia, like Canada, etc. And we're right now working how to scale those raw material supply chains beyond the first factory that we're building in northern Sweden. And I do think it is going to be super important for EU to really drive strategic partnerships with countries that sits on these assets to build even stronger supply chains, because the upper hand today obviously is with China. They are incredibly active in Africa, in Indonesia, etc., where there is very strong growth of these strategic minerals. And I think we need to be significantly stronger there as a united Europe.
So how are you preparing for a potential increase in the tensions between China and the US around Taiwan?
From our perspective, for example, one of the things that we're doing is that we're building a joint venture in Portugal to build what we think is the largest lithium refinery in Europe. We're building it together with Galp in order to build independent supply chain and independent dependency of China, both on lithium as well as on graphite and some other areas. You mentioned cobalt. We are today incredibly dependent, but there is an effort, a strategic effort to build independent supply chains. It will take a little time, but we will get there.
What's a little time?
I would, a 5-year period with some significant effort.
I was going to ask you, you mentioned the access to critical raw materials, and when we have this discussion around these materials and around China or other countries, we only talk about the access, but we never talk about the access to the trade routes. So how does Europe maintain or become strategic sovereign with regards to access to trade routes?
Okay, first, I'm always surprised when I hear such sad speeches. We have here 3 CEOs of amazing companies in Europe. And you talk about the past 15 years, but I think we all need to change our mindset. Who's got 5Gs? Europe, right? The US hasn't got that technology. We just don't have it enough everywhere in Europe. And by the way, we have 2 European companies, and if everybody was endowed with that, then we could develop a lot of technology. So the unique market is not just us, it's also you. You're talking competencies. On digital, we're training as many scientists as the US, but they go to the US. Do we offer them the same condition here? Perhaps we should be thinking about that too. There has been a revolution. Would you have heard about industrial policy only 2 or 3 years ago? Frankly, that was like a French idea. You know, again, the state intervening. There is an industrial policy. State aid has been relaxed. Germany is the main beneficiary of it. So I'm very surprised, to say the least.
Very diplomatic.
Now, on your question, sorry, which I forgot.
Yeah, so much goes into being strategic.
No, critical raw materials is, so there are 2 things. One is critical raw materials, super important. I was very happy to hear how you're dealing with it. France had been setting up a fund, public-private, to help secure raw materials, because it's true that it's often in areas of the world which are not always secure, and there's a fight for this. It's scarce. We must work together. And now Germany is doing the same. And I think this is an example of a great Franco-German collaboration. We need to deepen and extend, I agree, but it's something which is very big. Trade routes. We have here as well the opportunity as Europeans to actually help businesses, that is, if they want to be helped, of course. One is export credit. The 2 countries in Europe doing the most export credit are France and Germany, and then a few others. We can use that as a leverage to access some of these raw materials and to support trade. The same, we've talked about global gateway. We need to give meat on this skeleton as well. And funding, and there's a lot of funding, it's scarce, it's multiple, exists, and we can get better organized.
In your speech, you mentioned that only certain 5G makers should be allowed in our system. And I thought, what was going on in your head when she mentioned that?
Look, first, let me say, I didn't think that is a sad story for me, because if I see the magenta light here, you know, I feel always good. But independent from that one, you know, 10 years ago, Deutsche Telekom had a market cap of 30 billion. And we decided to go outside of Europe because we thought the preconditions of these markets are not sufficient. And then we invested in the US. Today, Deutsche Telekom is more worth than Vodafone, Telefonica, Orange, and British Telecom together, thanks to the US market and thanks to the precondition of that market. We are growing people and employees, 75,000 people in the US. At the same time in Europe, Europe has lost 50% of their workforce in the telecommunication market. So it's not a sad story. Capital markets are not emotional. We are looking to the facts. We are entrepreneurs who are investing where you get money for the buck. Simply as that. And you don't get it in Europe. And the politicians should question, should Europe be an area where we can invest patriotically, where it makes fun to grow our business and where we can think. If you're not making profits or sufficient profits here, how can you go into innovation? How can you build supercomputers or whatever? I would love to build a big software company, you know, aside, but my money is so focused on telecommunication, and it's always, you know, the hedgehog and the bunny, and I can tell you it's not sufficient in telecommunication, what is that's left over. So I think, you know, the question is, what is the framework in which entrepreneurs or companies are operating in certain industries? And it's good if we have some industries which are developing nicely, and I'm only talking for the digital ecosystem, but where are the cloud providers in Europe? Where is AI? If I would be a startup and I have to share with Digital Market Act, with the AI Act, which is now being discussed, with the GDPR, and with all the legal consistencies, I would not start my company here. I'm not able as a startup to handle AI here. I go outside of the market and build my company in this environment. And this is my problem I have with Europe. We are talking the right things, and I'm sad if Europe is becoming a region for the Chinese traveling and watching our nice castles and having hotel visits. I want an industry production here. I want a telecommunication lead here. I want an AI and innovation hub here in Europe. But I can only tell you, the framework of the politicians and from the regulatory environment from Brussels is not given. And even if you have good intentions in Brussels, we have IPSAI money, which I think is a consequence of saying we have put money into IPSAI. I can tell you, since 2.5 years, we are trying to apply to get 1 cent out of this IPSAI for. Then the bureaucracy is so complex that at the end of the day, you need endless to get the funding for this future project. I think it's not sad. We have to wake up and just, you know, slip up the sleeves.
Can I ask you something?
I'm sorry for being that emotional, but if somebody is saying a sad story, you know, he is guilty. I don't feel guilty because I have taken big decisions by investing on an annual basis 21 billion.
Yeah. May I ask you something?
So,
why are you still in Europe?
Look,
why are you still in Europe?
We are in Europe because, you know...
Yeah, why are you personally still in Europe?
Look, we have sold some markets and have closed them, and in the markets where we're operating, we have still, you know, a decent profitability, but we have a significantly better profitability in the US. Yeah, and that is why we have now 70% of our activities in the US market. But I think that's not the relevant question. The question is, you know, the whole portfolio and, let's say, the overall profitability of a company which we are operating in.
Now, we have 3 CEOs here on the panel. We had Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, in the headlines today with regards to economic safety and the idea of perhaps implementing export controls for know-how. How do you 3 feel about that? I've never silenced 3 CEOs at the same time, I have to admit. Oh, so Ursula von der Leyen made the headlines today with regards to economic safety and with the idea of export controls on know-how. How do you 3 feel about those things? Maybe you would like to start. Peter Carlsson.
I can comment a little bit around it, and we acquired a technology company 2 years ago in Silicon Valley called Cuberg that is doing a 50% higher energy density battery for aviation, and we spent a year negotiating with the Department of Defense and Department of Energy around how we would maintain the core IP in North America and how we would prevent that core IP to be diluted to certain countries. I don't think that was a bad process for critical IP that was developed, and I could see Europe being a little bit more aggressive around that.
Mm-hmm. How about you, when it comes to innovation in the banking sector? Who are the key players, and
look in the banking sector? First of all, I think you need to differentiate. I think in particular when it's about client data, when it's about everything what is really to the belongings of clients, we need to be extremely careful, and I think there we should work with all the regulations we have, and potentially we even need to improve further regulations. There is no doubt. But I think what we miss a little bit in the discussion, you know, when I have here this word Zukunftswende, and I take your point very serious, and I'm also not a sad CEO, otherwise I wouldn't have turned, or we wouldn't have been able to turn around the banks, and to be honest, I think the overall European banks turned around quite nicely over the last 15 years and have been actually part of the solution, in particular during the COVID crisis. But what we discuss here, where do we go from here? And the key item is, how do we make sure that we get growth back into the system? And you cannot get growth back into the system if you downscale or if you focus on individual markets. And therefore, my request is only, if we want to grow from here, we need to actually think about how we can grow together as Europe, think about items which we discussed for years and years, and therefore the fact that the capital market share dropped from 20% to 10%, that means that net new investments are not going into Europe. That is something which we should take damn serious. And if we take it serious, because I also said at the end of the day, the investors want Europe because of the engineering, because of the manufacturing, because of our democratic values, but then we also need to provide the platform for that. And therefore, I do believe if we really talk about Zukunftswende, then let's talk about that, what is missing. And I think we now need to take the decisive step, by the way, that also individual countries need to make compromises in order to move ahead. And that's, I think, what we owe the next generation, because I grew up in a fantastic Europe, but if we want to maintain that welfare, what we have right now, we need to invest. And for investments, you need financing. And there, I think we have, for the time being, a little bit of a sad story.
I think
Sorry.
Yes.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, we've been working on the Capital Market Union, as you know, since the financial crisis, roughly, and the Banking Union. And we are making progress. I agree it's too slow. I used to be in the insurance business, so I know what it is to have 27 prospectus in different countries. I completely understand. What I was trying to say is it's true we have a lot of progress to make. But I think if you look at things objectively, over the past 2 years, we as Europeans, France, Germany, and all the others, huge progress. Perhaps not fast, and I've been highlighting some shortcomings, but we have done them. And you're right, we need more investment. We won't manage the energy transition without more investment from the private sector as well as public. Same with the digital transition. We are welcoming any suggestions of harmonizing regulation. You know how tough it is since you work in all those countries. And this is something that firms, business, and policymakers can actually do together. What I was trying to highlight is the changes in terms of state aid, in terms of regulation. I said we need to cut down on bureaucracy. What I was also trying to highlight is the change that you've seen in industrial policy clearly goes against the competition policy we have been having for the past 10 to 20 years. And I think it's a marked change that we should all embrace, right? Because it will help also what you were saying, to reduce the fragmentation of the market. But I've never known a winning, you mentioned football champion team who was not bracing itself for success before criticizing on what could be improved. That's just what I was trying to say. Thank you.
So our time is, it's your applause. Our time is almost up, and I don't want to let you all go without asking the question around decoupling and de-risking with regards to strategic sovereignty. Now, I realized you didn't really want to go into the Huawei discussion, which I kind of handed at you, but in your business, and if you think about the 5G makers and the parts makers, de-risking versus decoupling from China, for example, where do you draw the line?
First, I'm not hiding away from the discussion about Chinese equipment. You know, we underlying legal requirements where we are fulfilling CRITIS in every regard. In the IP aggregation network, in the core network, there's not any Chinese equipment at Deutsche Telekom. The question is, you know, is an antenna a critical element, yes or no? And, you know, we can argue that now. Under the German law, it is not perceived as a critical element. By the way, every mobile phone is an antenna and a sender as well, so you can question that in this regard as well. So we are fulfilling legal requirements, and if Germany would decide, we are banning all Chinese equipment, fine, then we will immediately do everything, to fulfill these requirements. I believe, that it's not a wise recommendation, because we should manage the interdependencies of industries. I just believe that, banning an antenna would have consequences to other industries which are sitting maybe here in the room, who are trying to sell their products into China at that point in time. Second observation, I believe that, open markets, international competition, the battle of ideas, and the best solution is what is driving evolution, what is driving wealth. And therefore, I'm for open markets. I'm not for protectionism or closing or whatsoever. I recently heard a car manufacturer who said, if you can survive in the Chinese market, you can survive everywhere. And therefore, we are training our muscles in China, to be competitive in India and other markets as well, which I find, let's say, quite a wise comment. So therefore, if and there are areas where we see unfair competition, where we subsidization, where we see that states are abusing, a fair on eye-level competition. In these cases, I think companies must be protected. And therefore, I'm not sure whether we are now making a totally change in our policy, or whether we are using our legal instruments which we currently have. And with regard to the US, for us, the US is the best partner in the world. I do not want to have, let's say, a close border between the US and Germany. These guys are helping us. Without the Ukraine, it would be in a devastating situation. They share our values, Americans. We have learned from them. A lot of our industries have high dependencies from technology to be successful. So therefore, I think the TTC, the negotiations with the Americans, a good and open dialogue, and a regulatory environment in Europe, which is adapting the same rules of the game as the Americans, I think this would be a better solution than closing the borders. But there is no simple yes or no to your answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. That's why I'm so happy to get different perspectives during these 2 days on it. De-risking, decoupling, where's the line?
Well, I think, if you look at the overall European industry, I think, we can't talk about decoupling. And, we always tend to talk about the global DAX companies, the global CAC 40 companies, but look at the family-owned and mid-cap companies who have a huge dependency on China. Now, we can all say, what did we do in this regard potentially wrong from a concentration point of view? But we are there, and therefore I think it's all about the right level of de-risking and making sure that we diversify more. And diversify means that we need to find new markets. By the way, like we discussed tonight, the first new market is one European home market. That would be the first step of further de-risking. And we can see actually in Deutsche Bank a lot of mid-cap clients, family-owned clients who are approaching us in order to get the advice on how can we actually diversify our network into more Asian, Latin American, but also African countries. And this is exactly what we should do. I think decoupling from China would be exactly the wrong signal. And again, would put us into a huge uncompetitive situation, and therefore it can only be diversifying and, in this regard, de-risking.
Where would you draw the line between de-risking and decoupling?
I think we are incredibly dependent on Asian companies in this transition, specifically in my field. I do think it is important to create regional champions. Out of a couple of reasons. One is that I do believe that the economic growth of Europe is significantly larger if we have regional champions that work with university, that innovates, that work with machine builders, that is building supply chains, etc. The economic development for a region and the competitiveness for the customers, the car industry and other industries, is crucial. So I think that is very important. The other thing is on sustainability. An average Asian battery today that is being imported comes with a carbon footprint of somewhere between 100 to 150 kg of CO2 per kilowatt hour. If we transition the entire car industry with that footprint, we're creating a new carbon footprint the size of half Germany's. And I think that's not the intention of the green transition. And I think we want to do it in another way. And Europe can show the way there.
Laurence, Boone, what can Germany and France do together so that Europe does not turn into Venice, a term that our former economics minister Sigmar Gabriel once used in a speech, and which kind of, goes in the same direction that you just mentioned. You don't just want tourists here in Europe. It's old, it's beautiful. It used to be really important for trade and for the global economy, but now it's just beautiful.
There has been a huge change, as I was saying, over the past 2 years, and we need to accelerate on this change. I mean, you're the examples of successful businesses, right? So there are three things. One is competency. We lack skilled people. We do have good people, but not enough. We must train them, and we must retain those people who leave Europe to go elsewhere. And this governments cannot do alone. They need to do it with businesses, right? Because they employ people. So we need that competency, also because we've got a demographic problem. We need to decide what's strategic. And I think it's been decided. It's basically everything, but it's green and digital, energy and digital. And I think these two are keys. And one of the things is to move faster on reducing our dependency in energy in terms of gas and increasing what we can produce ourselves or diversify widely. And the third thing, I think we all agree, we need to complete the single market. This is our biggest attraction and our biggest strength. And it's not perfect, far from it, but we are having a good basis, and we are a lot more pragmatic than we used to be. And on this, France and Germany can really work together.
And with this, we will close the panel for tonight. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much for your attention. And I know these discussions aren't always easy, and there are lots of emotions involved, which shows how much we all care about Europe. Thank you.